A young police officer makes what she believes to be a routine arrest, until a leaked video reveals a shocking truth. As the evidence stacks up against her, she faces an impossible choice: protect her career or expose a system that taught her to do wrong from the start. But will revealing the truth bring justice, or will it drag her into an even deeper, more dangerous spiral? Have you ever seen a case where justice was manipulated? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you love powerful stories about truth and justice, make sure to follow so you don't miss what's next. Now, let's dive into this gripping story, one that begins with a single mistake that changes everything. Middleton, a city that talks about justice, but doesn't always deliver it. Beneath the surface, a silent network of corruption has shaped the way law enforcement operates for decades. And if you were black, that system saw you as a suspect before it saw you as a person. For the city's black residents, encounters with the police weren't just routine. They were unpredictable, dangerous. A simple stop for questioning could spiral into an arrest. A wrong move, a wrong look, or even the wrong neighborhood could mean handcuffs, a record, or worse. The officers who patrolled these streets weren't all bad. Many believed they were protecting the city. But they'd been trained to see threats where none existed. Officer Rebecca Hayes had always wanted to wear the badge. At 27, she was one of Middleton PD's rising stars. Sharp, disciplined, eager to prove herself. She came from a long line of police officers. Her father, her grandfather, they'd worn the uniform with pride. She had been raised to believe that the badge stood for honor, authority, and justice. And from the moment she entered the academy, she absorbed one fundamental lesson: control the situation at all costs. The best officers didn't hesitate. They asserted authority first, questioned later. That's how you kept order. That's how you survived. It was her first solo patrol. No training officer beside her, no one looking over her shoulder. Today, she was the one in charge. The radio crackled and her pulse quickened. A call from dispatch. Suspicious black male loitering outside a convenience store. Caller reports nervous behavior. Rebecca's grip tightened on the wheel as she responded. Unit 247, en route. She drove with purpose, scanning the street as she approached the scene. And then she saw him. Jamal Carter stood by the entrance, scrolling through his phone, waiting for a friend. Dressed in business casual, looking like he belonged anywhere but inside a police report. He had no idea a single call had already marked him as a potential threat. Rebecca stepped out of her car, one hand on her belt, her training kicking in. Authority first, questions later. She took a breath. Then in her most commanding voice, she called out to him. Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the building. Jamal looked up, confused. Is there a problem, officer? Rebecca didn't answer right away, because in that moment, something shifted. The way he stood, the way he spoke, it didn't match what she had expected. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't evasive. He was just there, a flicker of hesitation. Then she pushed it aside, training over instinct, badge over doubt, hands where I can see them. And just like that, Jamal Carter's life was about to change forever. Rebecca tightened her grip on her belt, her training kicking in. Authority first, questions later. Sir, I need to see some ID. Jamal Carter frowned, confusion flickering across his face. What? Why? Not defiant, not aggressive, just confused. Rebecca felt her jaw tighten. This was the moment, the choice. She could stop, take a breath, see him for who he was, a man waiting for a friend, not a threat. Or she could follow what she had been taught. Hesitation was a problem. Questioning authority meant resistance. Sir, I need you to hand over your ID, now. Jamal let out a breath, shaking his head. I'm just waiting for someone. I haven't done anything wrong. Rebecca's fingers curled. It was happening. The shift. How many times had she seen this in training? A suspect refusing to comply. An officer escalating to maintain control. That's how you kept order. That's how you stayed safe. Turn around, she ordered, her voice colder now. Hands behind your back. Jamal's brows furrowed. He stepped back slightly, his hands half raised in a gesture of disbelief. Wait, what? What's going on? A step back, a hesitation. Rebecca's heart pounded. She had to act before she lost control. She reached for his arm. Don't pull away, she warned. Jamal flinched. Not resisting, just instinct. Just the sudden shock of being grabbed. That was all it took. Rebecca yanked his arm back, using her weight to force him forward. He stumbled, trying to keep his balance. "Stop resisting," she snapped. He hit the pavement, his cheeks scraping against the rough concrete. His breath came out in a harsh gasp, his body jerking from the impact. "I'm not." The click of metal, cuffs locking around his wrists. Rebecca exhaled, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. Control. She had maintained control. That was what mattered. Then came the voices. A murmur. A shift in the air. She looked up. A woman stood frozen near the entrance of the convenience store, her phone clutched in her hands. A man in a business suit had stopped mid-step, watching. Further down the sidewalk, an older woman pressed a hand to her mouth. Eyes. So many eyes. And in them, something that made Rebecca's stomach twist. Not respect, not reassurance that she was doing her job. No, this was something different. Horror, anger, disbelief. The weight of those stares pressed down on her like an invisible force, colder than the metal of the cuffs in her hands. For the first time, a thought crept in, one she wasn't ready for. What if I was wrong? But it was too late now. The cuffs were on. The call was made. Jamal Carter was going to jail. Rebecca adjusted her grip on the cuffs, her heartbeat still hammering in her ears. She had done everything by the book. Command, control, compliance. That was the job. That was what she had been trained to do. So why did it feel like the ground beneath her was shifting? The air had changed. It was heavier now, thick with something she couldn't quite name. She could feel it pressing in from all sides. It wasn't the usual sense of authority settling into place, the quiet compliance of bystanders trusting that an officer had done the right thing. This was something else. Across the street, Detective Robert Shaw leaned against his unmarked car, arms crossed. He had been watching since the moment Rebecca pulled up. At first, it had just been a habit, keeping an eye on the rookies, seeing how they handled themselves. But now he wasn't just watching. He was analyzing. Something about this wasn't right. Shaw had seen enough arrests to know what real resistance looked like. He had seen criminals who ran, who fought, who had something to hide. But Jamal Carter? Jamal wasn't resisting. He was stunned, blindsided. Still trying to piece together how standing outside a convenience store had landed him face down on the pavement. Shaw exhaled slowly, a nagging feeling settling deep in his gut. He had heard the call come in. Suspicious male loitering. And even then, something had made him pay attention. It was the kind of call that came across the radio too often. It was the kind of call that always seemed to mean the same thing. He had worked in this city long enough to know the pattern. Black man. No crime. Just existing in the wrong place. And now, watching Rebecca, watching the way she stiffened under the weight of the moment, he realized something else. She knew it too. A few feet away, a young woman lifted her phone, the red recording light blinking in the corner of the screen. Rebecca saw her. Their eyes met. The girl wasn't hiding what she was doing. She wanted this on camera. She wanted the world to see. And suddenly, Rebecca felt a new kind of pressure. Not from Jamal, not from the voices in her radio, but from the silent judgment of that tiny lens, capturing every second. For the first time, a thought struck her like a hammer. If I did everything right, why does it feel so wrong? But it was too late. Whatever happened next wasn't just between her and Jamal anymore. It was in the hands of a dozen screens, a dozen angles. It had already left her control. The station buzzed with the usual morning chaos. Phones ringing, officers chatting over stale coffee, the low hum of dispatchers relaying calls. But as Rebecca stepped inside, all she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. She kept her posture straight, her movements controlled, just like she always had. Just like she'd been trained. She handed over her report, detailing the arrest, sticking to the script she knew would be expected of her. Suspicious male, non-compliant, escalation necessary, no hesitation, no doubt, and yet haze. She turned at the sound of her name. Kangsatrung Arnold Briggs stood near the coffee station, his imposing frame filling the doorway. Decades on the force had given him the kind of presence that commanded a room without effort. His uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable, until he took a step closer. Then he smiled. Good work out there. A firm hand clapped against her shoulder, solid and deliberate. You did the right thing, he said. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Don't let them think they can challenge you. Rebecca nodded, her jaw tight. Yes, sir. Briggs studied her for a moment, as if measuring her response. Then, with a final approving nod, he moved on. lost in the flow of the station. The approval should have reassured her. It should have solidified what she already knew, that she had done her job, followed her training, kept control of the situation. Instead, it settled in her stomach like a stone. She turned back to her desk, flipping open her case log, forcing herself to focus. She had paperwork to file, statements to review, but the words on the screen blurred in front of her. Because in the back of her mind, the voice of her commanding officer was still echoing. Not his words, but what lay beneath them. Not, "You protected the city." Not, "Justice was served." Just, "Don't let them challenge you." As if that was the most important thing. As if that was what this had been about. Rebecca exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers against the cool surface of her desk. She had done everything right. Everything according to protocol. So why did it feel like she was the one on trial? Patricia Carter sat motionless in the waiting area of Lawson & Associates, her hands gripping the strap of her purse so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The hum of distant conversations, the ringing of office phones, it all blurred into the background. The only thing she could focus on was the burning weight in her chest. Her son was sitting in a holding cell, not because he had done anything wrong, not because he had committed a crime, because he had been there. She had raised Jamal to be careful, to be respectful, to follow the rules. But what good had it done? When the receptionist called her name, Patricia forced herself to stand, smoothing the wrinkles from her dress with trembling hands. She walked into Daniel Lawson's office, bracing herself for what came next. Lawson was already watching the video. Patricia didn't need to explain. It had made its way to him. It had made its way to everyone. The screen flickered as the video played. Jamal stood outside the store, scrolling through his phone. The officer stepped out of her car, scanning him like he was already guilty of something. The moment she decided, the moment everything changed. Then came Jamal's voice, tentative, confused. "Wait, what? What's going on?" Then the sharp command, then the struggle, then the sound of his body hitting the pavement, the gasp, the scrape of handcuffs locking into place. Patricia squeezed her eyes shut for half a second. She had already seen it, a dozen times. She had replayed it in her mind over and over. Hearing her son's voice, seeing the fear in his eyes, Lawson leaned forward, exhaling through his nose as he paused the video. His fingers tapped against the desk in a slow, steady rhythm. Same story, different day, same injustice, different face. "This isn't just an isolated incident," he said, his voice measured but sharp. "This is systemic." Patricia already knew that. But this time, she wasn't going to let it go. This time, she was ready to fight. The courthouse was silent, except for the steady, deliberate sound of Judge Malcolm Everett's gavel striking the bench. He had seen many cases like this before. Too many. A black man arrested for nothing, a police officer standing by her report, a system that swallowed people whole and called it justice. But this time, something was different. Everett scanned the courtroom, his sharp eyes taking in the scene before him. Jamal Carter sat beside Daniel Lawson, his mother gripping his hand tightly. Across the room, Rebecca Hayes sat stiffly at the prosecution table, her uniform still crisp, but her posture different. Not the same confidence she had when she first walked into the precinct. Not the same certainty in her actions. She was waiting, bracing. She knew this wasn't just another case. This was about to become something much bigger. Everett let out a slow breath and tapped the file in front of him. He had reviewed it over and over. The arrest report, the video footage, the contradictions between the two. He had been young once. He had believed in the system, followed its rules, until that same system had tried to crush him. And now he was the one with the gavel. "This case," he said, his voice calm but firm, "is not just about one arrest." His words rippled through the courtroom. "This case will determine whether justice is blind or just looking the other way." A murmur spread through the crowd. The journalists in the back scribbled furiously. Everett glanced at Rebecca, who sat rigidly, eyes fixed forward. She was about to take the stand. She was about to answer for what she had done. And for the first time since this all began, she wasn't sure what the right answer was. Inside the precinct, Police Chief Arnold Briggs sat behind his desk, fingers drumming methodically against the polished wood. The glow from his desk lamp flickered over scattered reports, but his eyes were locked on the screen before him. A pending request from the courthouse. An official order to submit the dashcam footage from Officer Rebecca Hayes' patrol car. Briggs exhaled slowly. He had seen this coming. The video had spread too fast, reached too many eyes, and now the wrong people were asking questions. He picked up the phone, his voice calm, steady. "Scrub the dashcam." A brief hesitation on the other end. "Sir, the request has already been filed with the court." Briggs clenched his jaw. "Then make sure it doesn't exist when they come looking." Another pause. But no refusal. There never was. They had done this before. Delete the footage, erase the records, rewrite the truth. By the time anyone realized the evidence was missing, it would be a clerical error, a technical malfunction. Nothing more. Briggs had spent decades ensuring the system remained intact. A single rookie officer and a damn video weren't going to bring it crashing down. But across the city, in a darkened apartment, someone else was watching. A laptop screen flickered. Code scrolled in rapid succession. Firewalls breached one by one. The faint click of keys was the only sound in the room. Elliot Marsh leaned back in his chair, exhaling as he watched the precinct's digital logs update in real time. He knew what Briggs was trying to do, because he had seen it before. Once upon a time, he had been one of them. A cop, a believer, a fool. He had trusted the badge, trusted the system, and then he saw what happened when a good officer tried to do the right thing. He had walked away years ago, but he had never stopped watching, never stopped waiting. Now, he had his chance. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, bypassing encrypted archives, digging deeper. Dashcam footage, bodycam logs, internal memos. Every buried secret the department thought it had erased. Briggs thought he could bury the truth. Elliot was about to dig it back up. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken, every inch of space occupied by people who had come to witness not just a trial, but a reckoning. Rebecca Hayes sat on the witness stand, her uniform crisp, her posture upright, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was ready. She had followed protocol, done everything by the book, and today she would defend that. Across the room, Daniel Lawson adjusted his tie, flipping through his notes before looking up. His gaze locked onto Rebecca's, calm but unwavering. "Officer Hayes, let's go over your report again." Rebecca straightened. "Of course. You stated that Mr. Carter was acting suspiciously, correct?" "Yes. You also stated that he refused to comply." "He hesitated," Rebecca corrected. "In situations like that, hesitation can be dangerous. Officers are trained to act quickly to maintain control." Lawson exhaled, nodding slightly. Then he turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit C." A screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. Rebecca's stomach tightened. It wasn't her dashcam footage. It was something else. Another case, another suspect, another officer. A different black man stood on a sidewalk, hands at his sides. The officer in the video barked a command. He flinched, just slightly. And just like that, the officer threw him to the ground. The video cut to another clip. Another officer, another suspect. Same words, same hesitation, same takedown. Then another, and another. A silent wave of tension swept through the courtroom as screens lit up with a pattern too clear to ignore. Suspicious male, failed to comply, escalated due to non-compliance. Rebecca felt her fingers tighten around the edge of the witness stand. Lawson turned back to her. "Officer Hayes, are you familiar with these cases?" Rebecca swallowed. "No, sir." Lawson nodded, as if he expected that answer. He stepped forward. "If you weren't familiar with these cases, how do you explain that every single report sounds exactly like yours?" Silence. Rebecca opened her mouth, closed it. Lawson let the question linger, turning to the jury, then back to her. "All of these officers, each of them, gave the same justification you did." His voice didn't rise, but it pressed down on the room like a weight. "These aren't isolated incidents." He gestured toward the screens. "They're patterns, a system." Rebecca's breath felt shallow. The room wasn't just watching her anymore. They were judging her. The jury, the press, the people in the gallery. And then came the final blow. Lawson took a step closer, his voice quieter now, but sharper. "You say you were just following procedure, but Officer Hayes, let me ask you." A pause. The entire room seemed to lean in. "Who wrote that procedure?" The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca swallowed hard. For the first time since this all began, she didn't know what to say. The tension in the courtroom had thickened. pressing down on the air like a storm waiting to break. Judge Malcolm Everett sat at the bench, his expression unreadable as he opened the plain brown envelope that had been delivered moments earlier. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the pages inside. His breath slowed, his grip on the documents tightened. He had seen corruption before. He had seen evidence disappear, stories rewritten. But this wasn't sloppy cover-up work. This was deliberate, systemic, a machine built to protect itself. He closed the file, setting it down with a weight that seemed to echo through the room. "Mr. Lawson," he said, his voice steady but firm, approached the bench. The attorney walked forward, his brow furrowed as Everett slid the documents toward him. Lawson flipped through the first few pages, and then he stopped. His shoulders stiffened, his fingers pressed against the paper, his jaw clenching as he read. Then slowly he turned. His eyes landed on Rebecca. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Everett set his hands on the bench, his gaze unwavering. "It appears," he said, his voice controlled but heavy, "that certain evidence related to this case and others was intentionally altered or removed." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The jury shifted. Reporters scribbled furiously. The people in the gallery leaned forward, whispering among themselves. Rebecca felt her pulse hammering in her ears. Lawson turned back to her. "Officer Hayes, let me ask you again." His voice was calm, measured, but it cut through her like a blade. "Why did you really suspect Jamal Carter that night?" Rebecca opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She searched for the words, any words. But there were none. No reason, no justification, no answer. Because there was no answer. Only instinct, only training, only a system that had taught her to see him as a threat. Her hands gripped the edge of the stand, knuckles whitening. A rush of heat climbed up her neck. She felt the weight of every stare in the room. The jury, the press, the officer standing at the back. Then, without meaning to, her gaze shifted. Patricia Carter. She sat motionless in the gallery, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her shoulders didn't shake, her lips didn't tremble, but her eyes were shining with unshed tears. She wasn't angry. She wasn't screaming for justice. She was waiting. Waiting for Rebecca to see what she had done. Waiting for her to understand. A knot formed in Rebecca's throat. The uniform on her shoulders suddenly felt heavier, and for the first time since she pinned on that badge, she knew. She wasn't the victim here. She was the one who had done the damage. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from order, but the kind that comes before something irreversible. Rebecca sat frozen on the witness stand, her fingers pressing against the wood as if grounding herself. Every instinct told her to stay quiet. She could feel the system wrapping around her like armor. If she said nothing, she would walk out of here in uniform, her career intact. She could return to her precinct, file her reports, tell herself that she had done what she was trained to do. She could look the other way, like so many before her. And for the first time, she knew what that choice really meant. She felt it in Patricia Carter's tear-filled eyes. She felt it in Jamal's silent, waiting gaze. She felt it in her own shaking hands. The words clawed at her throat, demanding release. She swallowed hard, straightened her back, and turned toward Judge Everett. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady, but not unshaken. Everett looked up. "Yes, Officer Hayes?" A breath, a moment where the weight of every decision she had ever made came crashing down. "Then, I'd like to make an additional statement." A murmur rippled through the room. The prosecutor stiffened. Reporters' pens scratched frantically against their notepads. Everett's gaze sharpened. "Clarify, Officer Hayes." Rebecca exhaled, her pulse thrumming in her ears. "I'd like to testify." She swallowed. "Not just about this case, but about everything." The silence that followed was suffocating. From the prosecution table, a senior officer shifted, his stare like ice. At the back of the room, a uniformed figure reached for his phone. Rebecca knew what this meant. She knew what she was about to lose. She also knew it was already gone. She turned back to Judge Everett, gripping the witness stand as if steadying herself for impact. "I want to testify against the department." The room erupted. The system didn't fall overnight. It fought. It resisted. It did what it had always done, tried to protect itself. But this time, there were too many eyes watching. The footage, the testimony, the leaked documents, it was all there, laid bare for the world to see. And when the system could no longer deny the truth, It collapsed under the weight of it. Police Chief Arnold Briggs was the first to fall. The charges came swift and heavy. Evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to violate civil rights. The once untouchable man was now in handcuffs, escorted out of the precinct he had ruled for decades. But he was just the beginning. Internal Affairs launched a full-scale investigation. Hacker leaks, whistleblower accounts, and years of buried complaints surfaced all at once, exposing a deep network of corruption that had spread like rot through the department. Officers resigned, others were indicted. And for the first time, cases that had been long buried were being pulled back into the light. Wrongful convictions, lives shattered by false arrests, each case reopened, each name given another chance. The courtroom that once stood as a stage for Rebecca Hayes' trial was now a battlefield for a reckoning decades in the making. And for the first time, the system wasn't protecting itself. It was finally facing the truth. Jamal Carter was a free man. His name was cleared, his record wiped clean. The world now knew the truth, that he had been arrested for nothing more than existing in the wrong place, at the wrong time, in the wrong skin. But freedom did not erase the scars. Standing outside the courthouse, the air felt different. Lighter, maybe, but not right. Because justice hadn't come easily. It had taken a viral video, a courtroom battle, and a system collapsing on itself just to prove what should have been obvious. That he had done nothing wrong. That he never should have been there in the first place. A crowd gathered, reporters shouting, cameras flashing. His mother clutched his arm, relief in her eyes, but also something else. Something harder. Because they both knew, for every Jamal Carter who got a second chance, how many never did. Then, across the steps, he saw her. Rebecca Hayes stood near the courthouse entrance, her uniform gone, her future uncertain. She had testified. She had told the truth. But some things couldn't be undone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jamal stepped forward, his voice quiet but unshaken. If no one had filmed it, would I even be alive? Rebecca's breath caught. She had no answer, because they both knew the truth. Maybe she hadn't pulled a gun that night, maybe she hadn't fired a shot, but the system had trained her to see him as the threat. And if no one had been watching, she wasn't sure what she would have done. Neither was he. And that was the problem. The badge sat on the table. Rebecca Hayes stared at it for a long time, running her fingers over the worn edges. The metal still gleamed under the dim light, but it felt different now. Lighter. Or maybe she was the one who had changed. She had spent her whole life believing that this badge stood for justice, that wearing it meant she was one of the good ones, that as long as she followed the rules, she was doing the right thing. But now she knew the truth. The badge didn't make someone just. Their choices did. And so, for the first time, Rebecca chose justice over the badge. She walked into the precinct one last time, laid it down on the captain's desk, and walked out without looking back. Years passed. The headlines had faded, the protests quieted, the city had moved on. But Rebecca hadn't. She had spent years undoing what had been done to her. Unlearning, relearning, facing the things she had once refused to see. She could have disappeared, started over somewhere new, but she didn't. Instead, she found herself back in a courtroom, not in uniform, not as an officer, but as a witness. As the prosecution called her name, she stepped forward, her shoulders squared, her voice steady. She was here to testify, against officers who had once been just like her. She took the stand, looking out at the jury, at the cameras, at the people who had come to listen. Then she spoke the words she wished someone had told her when she first put on that uniform. Justice isn't about power. It's about truth. And this time, she was finally telling the whole truth. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across the steps. The air was still, heavy with the weight of everything that had come before. The fight, the fear, the doubt. But today, there was something else. Relief. Patricia Carter stood beside her son, watching as people filtered out of the building. Lawyers, reporters, families, officers who had once believed they were untouchable. She exhaled slowly, her fingers wrapping around Jamal's hand. For so long she had feared this moment would never come. That the system would win. That justice would remain just a word. But today, the truth had been spoken. The system had been forced to answer for what it had done. And for the first time in a long time, They weren't the ones who had to carry the weight. She looked up at the sky, the soft golden light reflecting in her eyes, and squeezed Jamal's hand just a little tighter. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried years of pain, years of hope, years of waiting for this day. We fought. She let out a breath, steady, unshaken. And today, we won. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Your support means everything. It fuels our mission to bring real, meaningful stories to light. Together, we can keep these conversations going, challenge the status quo, and fight for justice in ways big and small. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop seeking the truth.